Okay. 10th of September. Dis and Datinformation. Uh, what we're looking at is Michael Hudson's Killing the Host, How Financial Parasites and Debt Bondage Destroy the Global Economy of 2015. It's a complete text. It's available um, on in Google Docs for the Class Unity folks, but you can always download a copy to your own um, Google Drive or whatever. So we're up to, I think, somewhere around page 30, the financial sector's rise to power. So I will read this and perhaps there'll be some questions. A century ago, nearly everyone expected that as prosperity and wage levels increased, people would save more and have less need to go into debt. In the 1930s, John Maynard Keynes worried that the increasing propensity to save would lead people to spend less on goods and services, causing unemployment to rise unless public spending increased. Yet by 2008, the U.S. domestic savings rate fell below zero. Not only individuals, but also real estate industry and even government are becoming more indebted, or in economist speak, dis-saving. Trying to rise into the middle class these days is a road to debt peonage. It involves taking on mortgage debt to buy a home of one's own, student loans to get the education needed to get a good job, an automobile loan to drive to work, and credit card debt just to maintain one's living standards as the debtor falls deeper and deeper in the hole. Many recent graduates find that they have to pay so much on their student loans that they must live at home with their parents and cannot afford to get married and start a family, much less qualify for a mortgage. That is why consumer spending has not risen since 2008. Even when income rises, many families find their paychecks eaten up by debt service. This is what debt deflation means. Income paid to creditors is not available for spending on goods and services. In the 1930s, Keynes feared that as economies got richer, they would save more of their income, causing a shortfall in market demand. The problem today is that saving is not a result of people having more income than they want to spend. National income statistics count as saving the income spent in paying down debt. So the problem that Keynes feared, that is inadequate market demand, comes from being debt strapped, not from earning too much money. Debt deflation leads to defaults and foreclosures, while bondholders and banks get bailed out at government expense. In the workplace, many employees are so deep in debt that they are afraid to complain about working conditions out of fear of losing their jobs and thus missing a mortgage payment or utility bill, which would bump their credit card interest rates up to the penalty range of about 29%. This is called the debt traumatized worker effect, and it is a major cause of wage stagnation. Finance and land rent, how bankers replaced the landed aristocracy. The Norman conquest of Britain in 1066 and similar conquests of the land in other European realms led to a constant fiscal struggle over who should receive the land's rent, the king as his tax base, or the nobility to whom the land had been parceled out for them to manage, nominally on behalf of the palace. Increasingly, the hereditary landlord class privatized this rent, obliging kings to tax labor and industry. This rent grab set the stage for the great fight of classical free market economists, from the French physiocrats to Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, Henry George, and their contemporaries, to tax land and natural resource rents as the fiscal base. Their aim was to replace the vested aristocracy of rent recipients with public taxation or ownership of what was a gift of nature. The sun that the physiocrats cited as the source of agriculture's productive powers, inherent soil fertility, according to Ricardo, or simply the rent of location as urbanization increased the value of residential and commercial sites. Classical value and price theory was refined primarily to measure this land rent as not reflecting an expenditure of labor or enterprise, in contrast to buildings and other capital improvements, but as a gift of nature and hence natural patrimony. The main aim of political economy for the past 3 centuries has been to recover the flow of privatized land and natural resource rent that medieval kings had lost. The political dimension of this effort involved democratic constitutional reform to overpower the rent-levying class. By the late 19th century, political pressure was rising to tax landowners in Britain, the United States, and other countries. In Britain, a constitutional crisis over land taxation in 1910 ended the landed aristocracy's power in the House of Lords to block House of Commons tax policy. Sun Yat-sen's revolution in China in 1911 to overthrow the Qing dynasty was fueled by demands for land taxation as the fiscal base. And when the United States instituted the income tax in 1913, it fell mainly on rentier income from real estate, natural resources, and financial gains. Similar democratic tax reform was spreading throughout the world. By the end of the 20th century, land was passing out of the hands of the nobility to be democratized on credit. That was the only way for most families to acquire a home. Mortgage credit promises to enable home buyers to obtain security of their living space and in the process buy an asset rising in value. A rising share of personal saving for most of the population took the form of paying down their mortgages, building up their equity in real estate as the major element in their net worth. Yet no economist anticipated how far-reaching the results would be, or that real estate would become by far the major market for bank lending from North America to Europe. Nor was it expected that real estate prices would be raised not so much by raw population growth, that is the ratio of people to land, as by increasing leveraged bank credit and by rising public services, increasing site values, that is location, without recapturing this publicly created value in property taxes, which were cut. The result of democratizing real estate on credit is that most of the rental income hitherto paid to a landlord class is now paid to banks as mortgage interest, not to the government as classical doctrine had urged. Today's financial sector has thus been taken over the role that the landed aristocracy played in feudal Europe. But although rent no longer supports a landed aristocracy, it does not serve as the tax base either. It is paid to the banks as mortgage interest. Home buyers, commercial investors, and property speculators are obliged to pay the rental value to bankers as the price of acquiring it. The buyer who takes out the biggest mortgage to pay the bank the most gets the asset. So real estate ends up being worth whatever banks will lend against it. Finance as the mother of monopolies. The other form of rent that Adam Smith and other classical economists sought to minimize was that of natural monopolies, such as the East India companies of Britain, France, and Holland, and kindred special trade privileges. This was what free trade basically meant. Most European countries kept the basic infrastructure in the public domain, roads, railroads, communications, water, education, healthcare, and pensions, so as to minimize the economy's cost of living and doing business by providing basic services at cost, at subsidized rates, or even freely. The financial sector's aim is not to minimize the cost of roads, electric power, transportation, water, education, but to maximize what can be charged as monopoly rent. Since 1980, the privatization of this infrastructure has been greatly accelerated. Having financialized oil and gas, mining, power utilities, financial centers are now seeking to desocialize society's most important infrastructure, largely to provide public revenue to cut taxes on finance, insurance, and real estate, the FIRE sector. The United States was early to privatize railroads, electric and gas utilities, phone systems, and other infrastructure monopolies, but regulated them through public service commissions to keep prices for their services in line with the basic costs of production. Yet since the 1980s, these natural infrastructure monopolies have been taken out of the public domain and privatized with little regulation. The pretense is that by financing privatization of public enterprises, bank credit and financialized management help make economies more efficient. Thatcherism has been a disaster, most notoriously in the former Soviet economy since 1991. Carlos Slim's telephone monopoly in Mexico, U.S. pharmaceutical companies, and cable TV. The reality is that debt service, that is interest and dividends, exorbitant management fees, stock options, underwriting fees, mergers, and acquisitions add to the cost of doing business. Property speculators and buyers of price gouging opportunities for monopoly rent on credit have a similar operating philosophy. Rent is for paying interest. The steeper the rate of monopoly rent, the more privatizers will pay bankers and bond investors for ownership rights. The financial sector ends up as the main recipient of monopoly rents and land rents, receiving what the landlord class used to obtain. What is so remarkable is that all this has been done in the name of free markets, which financial lobbyists have redefined as freedom from public ownership of regulation. The financial sector has managed to mobilize anti-government ideology to pry away the public domain and lobby to block legislation. Government planning is accused of being inherently bureaucratic, wasteful, and often corrupt, as if the history of privatization deals is not one of corrupt insider dealing and schemes to obtain rights for rent extraction that makes such economies much less competitive. Financializing industry to turn profits into interest and stock buybacks. Early in the 20th century, the wave of the future promised to see banks throughout the world do what they were doing best in Germany and Central Europe, that is, coordinating industrial links with government and acting as forward planners. Academic textbooks draw appealing pictures of banks financing capital formation. Low interest rates are held to spur industrial investment by making it more profitable to borrow. But banks rarely fund new means of production. They prefer to lend for mergers, management buyouts, or raids of companies already in place. As for bondholders, they found a new market. In the 1980s wave of high-interest junk bond takeovers, lower interest rates make it easier to borrow and take over companies, and then break them up, bleed them via management fees, and scale back pensions by threatening bankruptcy. Like other sectors, industry was expected to become more debt-free. Bank lending focused on trade financing, not capital investment. Economists urged industry to rely mainly on equity so as to prevent bondholders and other creditors from taking over management and keeping it on a short leash. But industry has become financialized. Activist shareholders treat corporate industry as a vehicle to produce financial gains. Managers are paid according to how rapidly they can increase their company's stock price, which is done most easily by debt leveraging. This has turned the stock market into an arena for asset stripping, using corporate profits for share buybacks and higher dividend payouts instead of for long-term investment. These practices are widely denounced in the financial press, but the trend is not being checked. Financializing industry thus has changed the character of class warfare from what socialists and labor leaders envisioned in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Then the great struggle was between employers and labor over wages and benefits. Today's finance is cannibalizing industrial capital, imposing austerity, and shrinking employment, while its drive to privatize monopolies increases the cost of living. The financial takeover of government. Now, central banks were supposed to free government from having to borrow from private bondholders. But budget deficits have increased the power of financial lobbyists who have pushed politicians to reverse progressive income taxation, cut taxes on capital gains. Instead of central banks monetizing deficit spending to help the economy recover, they create money mainly to lend to banks for the purpose of increasing the economy's debt overhead, where we are now. Since 2008, the U.S. Federal Reserve has monetized $4 trillion in quantitative easing credit to banks. The aim is to reinflate asset prices for the real estate, stocks, and bonds held as collateral by financial institutions, and, of course, the 1%, not really to help the real economy recover. The situation is worse in the Eurozone. The European Central Bank has authorized €1 trillion, whatever it takes, as it said, Mario Draghi said, to buy bonds from banks, but refuses to lend anything to governments on principle, even though budget deficits are limited to only 3% of GDP. This imposes fiscal deflation on top of debt deflation. Governments are forced to rely on bondholders and increasingly to sell off the public domain. All this is contrary to what classical economists urge. Their objective was for governments elected by the population at large to receive and allocate the economic surplus. Presumably, this would have been to lower the cost of living and doing business, provide a widening range of public services at subsidized prices or even freely, and sponsor a fair society in which nobody would receive special privileges or hereditary rights. Financial sector advocates have sought to control democracies by shifting tax policy and bank regulation out of the hands of elected representatives to nominees from world financial centers. The aim of this planning is not for the classical progressive objectives of mobilizing savings to increase productivity and raise populations out of poverty. The objective of finance capitalism is not capital formation, but acquisition of rent-yielding privileges for real estate, natural resources, and monopolies. These are precisely the forms of revenue that centuries of classical economists sought to tax away or minimize by allying itself with the rentier sectors and lobbying on their behalf so as to extract their renters' interest. Banking and high finance have become part of the economic overhead from which classical economists sought to free society. The result of moving into a symbiosis with real estate, mining, oil, and other resources and monopolies has been to financialize these sectors. As this has occurred, bank lobbyists have urged that land be untaxed so as to leave more rent and other natural resource rent free to be paid as interest, while forcing governments to tax labor and industry instead. To promote this tax shift and debt leveraging, financial lobbyists have created a smokescreen of deception that depicts financialization as helping economies grow. They accuse central bank monetizing of budget deficits as being inherently inflationary, despite no evidence of this and despite the vast inflation of real estate prices and stock prices by predatory bank credit. Money creation is now monopolized by banks, which use this power to finance the transfer of property, with the source of the quickest and largest fortunes being infrastructure and natural resources pried out of the public domain of debtor countries by a combination of political insider dealing and debt leverage, a merger of kleptocracy with the world's financial centers. This is why the big banks are in Latin America. This is the thing that keeps making Argentina and Brazil, I guess, very difficult places. The financial strategy is capped by creating international financial institutions, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the European Central Bank, to bring pressure on debtor economies to take fiscal policy out of the hands of elected parliaments, which is where they should be, and into those of institutions ruling on behalf of bankers and bondholders. This global power has enabled finance to override potentially debtor-friendly governments. And so, financial oligarchy replaces democracy. All this contradicts what the 18th, 19th, and most of the 20th century fought for in their drive to free economies from landlords, monopolists, and coupon clippers living off bonds, stocks, and real estate, largely inherited the idle rich. Their income was a technologically and economically unnecessary vestige of past conquests. That is, privileges bequeathed to subsequent generations is the intergenerational inheritance stuff. When parliamentary reform dislodged landed aristocracy's control of government, the hope was that extending the vote to the population at large would lead to policies that would manage land, natural resources, and natural monopolies in the long-term public interest. Yet what Thorstein Veblen called the vested interests have rebuilt their political dominance, led by the financial sector, which has used its wealth to gain control of the election process to create a neo-rentier society imposing austerity. A cultural counter-revolution has taken place. If few people have noticed, it's because the financial sector has rewritten history and redefined the public's idea of what economic progress and a fair society is all about. The financial alternative to classical economics calls itself neoliberalism, but it is the opposite of what the Enlightenment's original liberal reformers called themselves. Land rent has not ended up in government hands, and more public services have been privatized to squeeze out more monopoly rent. Banks have gained control of government and their central banks to create money only to bail out creditor losses, not to finance public spending. This is where MMT, wants to step back in. The next few chapters review the classical analysis of value, price, and rent theory to show how free lunch economic rent has been taken away from the public domain by the financial sector. Instead of creating the anticipated symbiosis with industry, as was hoped a century ago, finance has backed the rent-extracting sectors. And instead of central banks creating money to finance their budget deficits, governments are now forced to rely on bondholders, leaving it up to commercial banks and other creditors to provide the credit that economies need to grow. The result is that today's society is indeed moving towards the central planning that financial lobbyists have long denounced. But the planning has been shifted to financial centers, that is, Wall Street, the city of London or Frankfurt, and its plan is to create a neo-rentier society. Instead of helping the host economy grow, banking, bond markets, and even the stock market have become part of a predatory extractive dynamic. This destructive scenario would not have been possible if memory of the classic critiques of rentiers had remained at the center of political discussion. Chapter 2, therefore, reviews how 3 centuries of Enlightenment reform sought to free industrial capitalism from the rentier overhead bequeathed by feudalism. Only by understanding this legacy can we see how today's financial counter-enlightenment is leading us back to a neo-feudal economy. When we talk about techno-feudal stuff, this is kind of what's happening. Marxism diagnosed the main inner contradiction of industrial capitalism to be that its drive to increase profit by paying labor as little as possible would dry up the domestic market. The inner contradiction of finance capitalism is similar. Debt deflation strips away the economy's land rent, natural resource rent, industrial profits, disposable personal income, and tax revenue, leaving economies unable to carry their exponential rise in credit. Austerity leads to default, as we're seeing today, at least in 2015 in Greece. The financial sector's response is to double down and try and lend enough to enable debtors to pay. When this financial bubble bursts, creditors foreclose on the public domain of debtor economies, much as they foreclose on the homes of defaulting mortgage debtors. Central banks flood the economy with credit in an attempt to inflate a new asset price bubble by lowering interest rates. U.S. Treasury bonds yield less than 1%, and the interest rate on German government bonds is actually negative, reflecting the flight to safety when debt write-downs look inevitable. In the end, even zero interest loans cannot be paid. Shylock's loan to the merchant of Venice for a pound of flesh was a zero interest loan. The underlying theme of this book thus can be summarized in a single sentence. Debts that can't be paid won't be. This all sounds incredibly pessimistic, but this is kind of where we are with this. And I suppose I could read further. but we may not. Nobody has the stomach, and no one can probably remember what I just said for the last 20, 25 minutes. But I hope that this is useful to think about, that there's been a kind of shift in what the original conception of a kind of functioning, well-functioning, coordinated economy looks like. There was some hope that the thing would sort of fix itself, because there was this sort of idea of, the original free market ideas sort of saw this whole thing as like a kind of perpetual motion machine that would, sort of naturally resolve itself. And theoretically, at least for mainstream economics, you had that sense, because, you had certain theorists who said, well, if we restrict enough variables, the thing will, it sort of looks like it will clear mathematically. But the reality is that it never clears. It just doesn't. And the same thing with unemployment, and jobs, et cetera. We'll hear a little bit more about that tonight. And I hope that certain parties will point out that certain other parties are idiots for not considering the issue that who actually has been creating jobs. Well, only the Democrats create jobs, and the Republicans do a very piss poor job on the issue of job creation. And they don't talk about it much. They only talk about it when it looks like it's going up, but it's not really. And ultimately, when you get to the end of whatever their tenure is, that it never really worked out, because they were continuously driving the economy into debt with all kinds of wacky spending, et cetera. And they were the true, talk about projection, the real tax and spend folks. It's just, it's all a canard. Anyway, are there questions? Brickbats. Yes, Kelly, there's a shifting of burden from property and powerful that is lobbyists to wage earners and spending economy. These are power shifts. And yes, Mitt and Bain Capital. Mitt was a smart guy. He created, certain types of funds that would, take advantage of these kinds of things because of financialization. And it works out really well when people aren't really paying good attention. It's unfortunate. Mitt Romney is voting for Kamala Harris. Actually, I think he announced his support for her. Let's see. What else? Hey, I think those are all the questions inciting me to rage.
Prof. Ann, we have a question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Um,
Not that I can.
Okay, I'll try. Do you think this is, a very slow pendulum, and perhaps it'll swing back to maybe moneyed classes and, the propertied and the wealthy actually figuring out that they do need to support the state somehow? That they've taken this too far. Hence,
Well,
Mitt's voting for Harris. They've gone too far in other ways.
Well, that's, I think, the Republican goal. But on top of the Republican goal, as we've seen now, we have these people who are somewhat beyond republicanism, right? We have Elon Musk, who does not believe in that. He believes in, just taking as much as you can, wherever you can, whenever you can, abusing power all over the place. That's not a Republican goal. I mean, if you were defending classic republicanism, the republicanism that is voting for Kamala Harris is the very straight line conservative republicanism. What you have in the case of whatever Trumpism is really, autocratic craziness that doesn't really care what happens to anybody. I mean, it is nihilistic in that sense. And unfortunately, everyone still supports these people. It's just amazing. Um, I don't know. That's not a good answer, but we can hope that there is a sense of trying to fix all this. But the Reagan Revolution created a kind of class of ideologue that fits in with all of this neoliberalism, and unfortunately begins to scoop up other extremist elements in it. You see, that was the whole business of Contract on America during the Clinton period, was creating this kind of weird reactionary thing that would help drive neoliberalism forward. And Clinton himself, promoted this kind of, oh, well, we should deregulate these things, et cetera, et cetera. And he had a whole bunch of stooges to try and do that and manipulate, well, for example, in the Telecom Act, to liberate the electromagnetic spectrum, which is like vaporware. It's like a Ponzi scheme, but they did it, and then they created this, kind of market chaos that was good for the economy at one level, but at another level, because it was not well regulated, created a whole, mishmash of all kinds of other problems that we're still having trouble with. That is, the differences in standards, that is global standards for certain things, and the disposition of, well, why we have a CHIPS Act now is partially because it goes all the way back to that period in terms of deregulating certain industrial policy. So it's a good idea to think that some sort of consciousness change would happen for people like Jeff Bezos, et cetera. But the reality is, I think they all become strangely reactionary at some point. Anna was pointing out in the chat that it's outrageous that you absolutely have to have a credit card in the US to get a credit score. Yeah, I think that's a deregulatory element as well. Now, nobody's regulating that. You could actually put a regulation that would actually allow, because that's where social credit is going. That's the whole business of, how much am I worth? That your worth becomes some index of this sort of type. And so social credit, as the Chinese have practiced it, there's kind of features of that will probably enter the American discourse. And you can see the front end of that with this voter ID card bullshit. On the one hand, everyone should have, proper identification. I just think that's a normal thing for a democracy. But the reason why we don't have it is to oppress people who don't have them, the poor mainly. And it is similar to the idea of needing a credit card in order to get a credit score. Essentially, what they do is they force you to have a bad credit score, is what kind of how that works, I think. Anyway. I mean, if you look at the advertising on television, it's just what they're convincing people to get in terms of this credit scoring business is to actually have a crappy credit score. I mean, the example that they use in the ads is crappy credit scores. Anybody else? We're getting close to the end. I made this short today because we have other matters are impinging, and at 7 o'clock is the red hour. I assume that other people will have things to discuss. We probably have to discuss how we're going to watch the debate if we want to watch the debate. I'm watching it just simply from a professional point of view. In other words, I'm going to probably write something, annoying about it, or something. And so I see it as a kind of bad research, but others may have, your mileage may vary. Okie dokie. Well, since I have the power, I'm gonna cut the live stream. Whoops. No, I don't have the power. I can't cut the live stream. Joe, can you cut the live stream, please? See, I'm not the host, therefore I can't do anything about the live stream.